On the very first morning after our wedding, my husband slapped me across the face in front of his entire family simply because I hadn't prepared a separate, fresh breakfast serving specifically for his sister. The sound of his palm striking my cheek was louder than the clattering of the plates on the table. But what hurt even more was that no one stood up to stop him. His mother sat perfectly straight, acting as if the scene unfolding before her was completely normal. His father kept his head down, continuing to eat his food as if nothing had happened. Meanwhile, his younger sister looked at me with cold, detached eyes, like she was watching a servant being rightfully punished. In that split second, I understood immediately. This house didn't want a daughter-in-law. They wanted a woman who would keep her head down, swallow her pain, and quietly live beneath their feet. But they were wrong. I placed my hands on the edge of the dining table and flipped the entire thing over in the blink of an eye. The sound of shattering plates and crashing glass echoed violently throughout the room. And that was the exact moment I decided I would no longer sacrifice my dignity for a family that disguised cruelty as a wife's duty. He used to be the kind of man who made me believe with all my heart that even if married life wasn't always a bed of roses, at least I wouldn't have to walk it alone. Throughout the 2 years we dated, Preston never missed a single detail. He remembered that I hated cilantro, that strong perfumes gave me a headache, and that I couldn't stand being in loud environments for too long. On the nights I worked late at the pharmacy, he would drive over and wait quietly in his car under the street lamp outside. He'd leave the AC running at the perfect temperature, place a cold bottle of water on the passenger seat, and flash me a gentle smile, making me feel like there was nothing to fear in this world as long as he was there. That was why on our wedding day, amidst the golden lights of a luxury hotel overlooking the Chicago River, I kept trying to comfort myself. I told myself that the certain coldness radiating from his family was just old-fashioned strictness, not an evil omen of the marriage that was just beginning. The reception ballroom that evening was flawless. Strands of white jasmine and purple orchids were meticulously arranged into elegant centerpieces on every round table. The faint scent of the floral arrangements mixed with the aroma of high-end catering, making everything feel soft, peaceful, and auspicious. Exactly the kind of American dream wedding families wish for their children. Yet, amidst all that beauty, my mother-in-law's gaze was the only thing that made me feel like I was standing in a room where the oxygen was slowly being drained away. Eleanor sat with perfect posture on a cream-colored velvet chair, a measured, polite smile painted on her lips. Her jewelry wasn't overly flashy, but every piece was expensive enough to announce her status without her having to utter a single word. She barely looked at me, even though I was the bride. She only looked at her son, watching his every move, observing everyone who came to greet him, assessing with her eyes whether I was truly worthy of standing beside him. During a private family moment before the reception, when I presented her with a heartfelt gift and thanked her according to tradition, my hands were steady, my voice was polite, and my demeanor was flawless. I was raised in a family that taught me good manners. I knew exactly how to conduct myself on such an important day. But as I stood before her, handing her the gift with both hands, Eleanor took it with sheer indifference. Without even looking me in the eye, she said in a flat voice, "A woman who comes into this family needs to know the word endurance much more than the word love." Honey, her words made a few older relatives nearby chuckle softly, as if it were just an endearing piece of advice from an elder at a joyous occasion. I forced a smile and nodded politely, but deep in my chest, I felt a heavy, ice-cold weight sink into my heart. There was zero warmth in her tone. It wasn't a warning from someone who wished me well. It was a silent declaration that I was stepping into a house that already had its unbreakable rules. And those rules were not created to protect me. Not long after that, as guests began mingling, taking photos, and offering congratulations, I started noticing small details that outsiders might have missed. Every time someone complimented me on my appearance, or told Eleanor how lucky Preston was to have such a sweet wife, she would smile demurely and follow up with something like, "Well, they have to take care of each other. My son works incredibly hard. If he has someone who knows her duties at home, things will be peaceful. Or she would say, women these days are great at their careers. Sure, but taking care of the home is always more important. On the surface, it sounded like the typical, traditional values of an older generation. But when it was repeated time and time again, surrounded by relatives nodding in agreement, I started to realize I wasn't being looked at as a new daughter-in-law. I was being placed into a specific slot, a position that required me to be submissive, patient, unquestioning, and most importantly, acutely aware that I was beneath them. I glanced at Preston multiple times, hoping he would pick up on the vibe, but every time, he just patted my hand gently under the table or leaned in and whispered, "Don't overthink it. Mom's like this with everyone." He said it with that same gentle smile that always used to calm me down. Yet on that day, I began to wonder for the first time, is it enough for someone to be gentle with you in private, if in front of his family, he allows you to be pushed down inch by inch without ever truly standing by your side? As the reception wound down and most of the guests left, leaving only close relatives, the bridal suite grew quiet. I changed out of my heavy wedding gown into a simple ivory dress, taking off some of the jewelry so I could finally breathe. As I was buttoning my cuffs, the door swung open. Eleanor walked in, trailing a faint, expensive perfume and carrying the unwavering posture of someone who had never been told no. She stopped right in front of me, making no move to sit, and immediately said, "Tomorrow morning, 600 a.m. sharp, be at the Oak Park house." I looked up at her in confusion. She continued in the same tone that left no room for refusal. "On the first day after the wedding, the new wife must enter the kitchen and cook breakfast for the elders of the house. This is our family tradition. Since you are now a woman of this family, you should start things off right." I froze for a moment, not because I didn't know what to say, but because it suddenly became crystal clear that everything that happened today wasn't a coincidence. It wasn't just strictness. It was a systematic laying of the groundwork to force me into the role they had designed for me from the start. I hadn't even been married for a full 24 hours, and I was already being summoned to prove whether I was fit to be a servant in their home. "Yes, ma'am, I'll be there on time," I replied flatly. She gave a curt nod as if this was merely what was expected of me, then turned and walked out of the room without another word. During the drive to our new luxury condo in River North, the lights from the skyscrapers reflected off the car windows in long, blurry streaks. I sat in silence, watching the city roll by meaninglessly before asking softly, "Does your mom talk to everyone like that?" Preston kept driving for a moment, then let out a soft laugh. "Mom is just a very direct person, but she's actually really sweet. She just places a lot of importance on family order. And you, do you agree with your mom?" He went quiet for a second before reaching over to grab the back of my hand. "I just want everything to go smoothly. Just go along with her for the first day. Once this passes, everything will be fine." His answer sounded like comfort, but at the same time, it felt like a gentle shove, pushing me into something I wasn't entirely sure I could call a family. I turned to look at the city lights again, letting the cool AC blow quietly against my face. A certain feeling began to curdle in my chest. It wasn't full-blown fear, but it certainly wasn't the joy a bride should feel on her wedding night. It was the intuition of a woman who was starting to smell something rotting beneath a beautiful rug. When we pulled into the new condo, which my father had paid the entire down payment for, I looked at the towering building. It was beautiful, peaceful, and supposed to be the warm beginning of our married life. But standing in the middle of our new bedroom that night, I felt like I was stepping into a story where I wasn't the wife, but merely another variable in someone else's tightly regulated life. Preston wrapped his arm lightly around my shoulders and said softly, "Tomorrow morning will be a little tiring, but once we get through it, it'll be nothing." I didn't answer right away. I just stared at the reflection of the two of us in the mirror at the foot of the bed. The man standing there looked exactly as gentle as he always had, but for some reason, in the dim light of our new bedroom, I started to see a gap between his image and reality. It was a tiny gap, so small that if I had loved him any less, I might have seen it more clearly, but because I loved him and because I trusted him, I chose to tell myself to stop overthinking. That night, I set my alarm for 5:00 a.m. I laid out a simple, modest outfit to wear to my in-laws' house and went to sleep with a restless heart. In the darkness, my mother-in-law's words kept looping in my head. A woman who comes into this family needs to know the word endurance much more than the word love. At that moment, I had no idea that the very next morning, I would learn firsthand that some families don't use the word endurance to teach people how to live together. They use it as the first chain to bind a woman who foolishly walked into their cage, armed with nothing but a heart full of love. At 5:45 a.m., I drove out of the condo into the pre-dawn darkness. The early morning streets of Chicago possessed a strange kind of silence. It wasn't a gentle peace, but a heavy quiet, as if the entire city was holding its breath before waking up again. I turned on some soft music for a few minutes, but quickly shut off. I didn't know what to listen to on a morning when my heart felt so heavy. The orange glow from the street lamps passed rhythmically over the windshield, a constant reminder that I was driving towards something I didn't want to face, purely out of a sense of obligation. I arrived at the house in Oak Park just a few minutes before 6:00 a.m. It was an aging two-story colonial. Its original cream paint had faded to a dull, almost gray hue. The wrought iron gate was stained with patches of rust, and the potted plants on the porch looked as though they had been placed there purely out of obligation. The soil inside was dry and cracked, untouched by water for God knows how long. I parked the car and sat motionless behind the steering wheel for a moment, staring at the house. It wasn't scary like a haunted house, but it carried a suffocating atmosphere. It looked like a place where someone had spent their entire life suppressing their own voice to the lowest possible volume until the house itself had absorbed that misery into its walls. I stepped out of the car, took a deep breath, and walked up to ring the doorbell. The door opened almost instantly, as if someone had been standing right behind it, waiting. Preston stood there in dark, casual clothes. His hair was unstyled, his face freshly washed. The faint smell of his shaving cream drifted out along with the cool air from inside the house. He gave me a thin smile and stepped aside to let me in. "You're early." "Good," he said, sounding like he was praising me, but the end of his sentence was so flat. I couldn't tell if it was meant to be warm or if he was just reading a script. I neatly placed my shoes by the door and followed him inside. The living room had only one lamp turned on. The pale, white light fell onto an old leather sofa and a coffee table covered in multiple overlapping water rings from old mugs. Eleanor was sitting right in the middle of the sofa, fully dressed in a neat blouse and slacks, looking as though she had been ready for hours. She held a TV remote, but her eyes weren't on the screen. They snapped directly to me the second I stepped into the room. "So, you're here," she said, her voice devoid of relief or welcome. She was merely acknowledging that I had arrived exactly as ordered. "Good morning, Eleanor," I said respectfully. She accepted the greeting with a microscopic nod before turning to change the channel at a leisurely pace. "The kitchen is in the back. The large skillet is in the bottom cabinet. There are eggs and bacon in the fridge. The potatoes are in the pantry bin. Figure out the rest of the ingredients yourself." A woman who runs a house needs to know how to manage things, not wait around for someone to tell her every little detail. She said all this without looking at me again, as if the conversation was completely over. Just like that, I was formally demoted from the status of a bride the night before to a full-fledged kitchen labor. This morning, I walked to the back of the house and pushed open the kitchen door, pausing for a second. The first smell that hit me was old cooking grease, mixed with cheap dish soap layered over a lingering mustiness in the corners of the room. The stainless steel sink was stained with hard water buildup around the faucet. The wall next to the stove was coated in a thin, sticky layer of accumulated grease splatters. The large refrigerator was covered in magnets, holding up flyers for med spa payday loan ads and some sort of payment schedule that I couldn't identify. I looked up at the cabinets and saw a stack of floral ceramic plates, several of which had chipped edges. Looking at the scene in front of me, I couldn't help but think of the family traditions my mother-in-law had spoken of last night, a house that constantly preached about rules and the duties of a woman couldn't even be bothered to maintain the very space they use to judge a woman's worth. I opened the fridge to see what I had to work with: a half-wilted bundle of spinach, a few decent tomatoes, a carton of eggs, a package of bacon tossed haphazardly onto a shelf, and some leftover steak from a previous night wrapped in plastic. I stood still for only a few seconds before my brain kicked into gear, organizing a plan. I could make a spinach and tomato quiche, crispy bacon, herb roasted potatoes, and maybe arrange a fresh fruit platter. Working in a pharmacy for years had trained me to manage whatever was put in front of me quickly and accurately, no matter how unpleasant the situation. I always trusted the steadiness of my hands and my own focus. I washed the produce, prepped the potatoes, cracked the eggs, and chopped the vegetables. Everything flowed in a steady, rhythmic pace. The sound of the knife hitting the cutting board echoed clearly in the quiet kitchen, feeling like the only honest sound in this entire house. My hands kept working, but my heart was slowly picking up on something clearer by the minute. From the second I walked into this house, no one had asked if I was tired. No one asked if the drive was exhausting or if I had eaten anything yet. There wasn't even an offer of a glass of water or a simple thank you for the trouble. The only thing they cared about was whether I would perform my duties adequately. Sometimes we don't realize the massive truth of a situation through huge events. Sometimes it reveals itself in the microscopic details, like the fact that no one cares to ask how you're doing on your very first morning as a new family member. Yet, everyone is entirely prepared to judge whether you are useful to them. Around 6:20 a.m., I arranged all the food onto the square wooden dining table in the small adjacent dining room. A beautiful, steaming quiche sat in the center. The roasted potatoes and bacon were plated neatly, and a side of fresh fruit was arranged in a separate bowl. I hadn't made anything excessively extravagant, but it was clean, hot, and more than enough for everyone. As I stepped back to look at the table, a brief thought flashed through my mind. If coming here this morning was truly just a tradition, at the very least, what I've done should prove that I respect this family enough. But that hope didn't last long. My father-in-law, Richard, walked out first. He was wearing an old t-shirt and cargo shorts, dragging his slippers across the living room floor to the dining table. He didn't even look at my face. He sat down at the head of the table, let out a soft sigh, and immediately picked up his fork, acting as if my presence there meant absolutely nothing beyond the fact that breakfast was waiting for him. "Good morning, Richard," I greeted him. He gave a quick, dismissive nod. Shortly after, Eleanor walked in and took her usual seat with practiced ease, as if every single thing in this house had a predetermined, unchangeable position. Preston followed right behind her and sat next to me. He acted as though absolutely nothing was weird about last night, as if there was no tension he needed to take responsibility for. He scooped some eggs onto his plate and muttered, "Looks good," but it was just a fleeting sentence, carrying no real weight, doing nothing to make me feel any better. I looked around the table and noticed there was still one empty chair. "Is Morgan not down yet?" I asked carefully, referring to his younger sister, whom I had barely spoken to the day before. Eleanor slowly stirred her coffee before answering. "Morgan isn't awake yet. She was up late last night. In that case, I set some portions aside for her. She can just heat it up when she wakes up," I said genuinely, thinking it was the easiest way to ensure everyone got a warm meal. The spoon in Eleanor's hand stopped dead. She looked up and locked eyes with me for the very first time that morning. Her gaze was so freezing that I felt the room temperature drop several degrees. This family doesn't eat reheated food. If a family member hasn't come down to eat yet, you prepare it fresh when they are ready. You don't just make a bulk batch and toss the leftovers aside," she said slowly, enunciating every word. "A woman who is going to be a daughter-in-law in this house needs to learn to prioritize the family over her own convenience." I opened my mouth to explain that I didn't mean it that way at all, but Preston tapped my knee gently under the table. From the outside, it looked like a comforting touch, but in reality, it was a silent warning. "Do not argue." I froze, right there. In that exact moment, my understanding deepened. This morning was never about breakfast. It was never about the taste of the food or the neatness of the table. What was being tested wasn't my culinary skill, but my level of submission. They wanted to see if I would accept the fact that my care was never enough, if it wasn't done exactly their way, and that my best intentions would instantly become a punishable offense if I didn't completely bow down to the rules of this house. I stood beside the dining table, watching the steam rise from the hot food and slowly vanish into the air, and I felt like I was standing in front of the very first lesson of my married life, a lesson far more brutal than I had ever imagined. That lesson was, sometimes a woman isn't invited in to be loved. She is summoned in to prove just how low she can be pushed down while still smiling and calling it her duty. I remained standing by the table while my mother-in-law's words hung in the air like invisible, icy needles, slowly piercing into me one by one. They didn't draw blood immediately, but they bruised the flesh underneath in ways no one else could see. Preston kept eating his food quietly, acting as though the scene unfolding was just a normal family chat rather than the verbal execution of a woman on her first day of marriage. Richard kept his head down, sipping his coffee, his eyes locked onto his own plate, as if he desperately wanted no part in any of this. The entire house was so quiet that the clinking of silverware sounded unnaturally loud. And it was within that silence that I realized sometimes you don't need a raised voice or profanity to break someone. When everyone unanimously acts like you have no right to feel hurt, that alone is enough to destroy you. I took a slow breath, trying my best to keep my voice as soft as possible. I didn't mean to just toss leftovers aside. I just thought that since Morgan is waking up later, warming up a fresh plate would be more convenient and it would prevent wasting good food. Eleanor looked up again. This time, the faint smile at the corner of her mouth didn't make her look kind. Instead, she looked like someone who had just caught her opponent daring to strike back. Wasting food is a term you use for things that have value. She set her spoon down softly, but the sound rang oddly loud in my ears. If a person in this house hasn't eaten it yet, how can you call it leftovers? Or do you think you can just cook one single meal, and whoever eats, eats, and whoever doesn't, it's their own problem? I pressed my lips together tightly. A certain emotion was rising in my throat, but I tried to maintain my composure. I don't think that at all, but your actions say otherwise. She snapped back instantly. A woman who truly cares thinks ahead for everyone in the house, not just cooking until she's done and then leaving whoever missed out to reheat the scraps themselves. With that final sentence, I heard it with absolute clarity. She wasn't talking about the food. She was talking about me. She wasn't judging my kitchen management. She was judging whether I had the qualifications to exist in this house. And the verdict had been tilted against me before I even picked up a knife to chop a vegetable. Just then, the sound of a bedroom door opening echoed faintly from upstairs, followed by the shuffling of slippers on the floor. Morgan, Preston's younger sister, walked out with messy hair, wearing a faded, oversized t-shirt, her face carrying the grumpy expression of someone who just woke up. She paused slightly when she saw everyone at the table, her eyes darting to me quickly before locking onto the spread of food. "Oh, where's mine?" she asked immediately, without so much as a good morning or an acknowledgement of me as her new sister-in-law. Her tone wasn't genuine confusion. It was the tone of someone eagerly looking for an opening to pick a fight. I turned to her. "I can plate some for you. Or, if you want something freshly made, I can cook another batch." Another batch. Morgan let out a short, humorless laugh. "So, you're saying everything on this table is just stuff you made for everybody else, and I'm supposed to be the one who gets the afterthought." Second batch. Before I could reply, Eleanor let out a long rhythmic sigh, exactly like someone whose worst expectations had just been validated. "See, I told you, a woman running a house needs to think more comprehensively than this." The phrase "woman running a house" dropped into the room like an anvil. I knew it wasn't a normal term in this context. It wasn't a compliment about my homemaking skills. It was a calculated reduction of my status. From a wife, from a new family member, I was being downgraded to a servant whose sole duty was to please everyone without question. Morgan walked over and sat in the empty chair. She picked up a piece of bacon with her fork, inspecting it like a health inspector before pouting her lips. Is this the bacon from yesterday's fridge? You're feeding me overnight meat. I looked at her squarely for the first time that morning. I tried to tell myself that maybe she was just cranky from waking up, but her face was full of pure satisfaction at being able to poke at me in front of the whole family. She wasn't a thoughtless kid speaking out of turn. She was a willing participant in the game. I just prepared what was available so it wouldn't go to waste. And I just made the quiche and potatoes from scratch. This isn't a soup kitchen. Morgan cut me off, leaning back in her chair, telling whoever comes late to just heat something up. That's just disrespectful. That sentence sounded like it had been rehearsed by the exact same scriptwriter, only the voice was different. I looked at Morgan, then at my mother-in-law, and instinctively turned to Preston. I was hoping for one single thing, that he would at least see that this was going way beyond an argument about breakfast. But instead, he picked up his glass of water, took a sip, glanced at me for a fraction of a second, and then looked away exactly like a man who knows he should say something, but actively chooses cowardice. His silence in that moment hurt worse than the insults from the two women combined. If his mother and sister viewed me as an outsider, I could eventually process and accept that. But the man who promised to take care of me for the rest of my life, if at the very moment I was being degraded right in front of him, he chose silence just to maintain his own comfort. I could no longer be sure if the gentleness he showed me for 2 years was genuine love, or if it was just the convenient mask of a man who had never been forced to choose between the woman he married and the toxic family that raised him. Eleanor took a slow bite of her food before speaking up again. Honestly, this kind of thing shouldn't have to be taught. If a woman comes in as a daughter-in-law and actually has the heart to take care of the family, she'll just instinctively know how to handle things. I stood frozen in place. The heat radiating from the hot food was suffocating, matching the boiling heat inside my chest. I tried my absolute best to take care of everyone. I said, "Your best isn't enough." She fired back instantly. "Some women are fantastic at working outside the house, but the second they come home, they have no idea how to take care of other people's feelings. It's useless." I heard it loud and clear. That wasn't just a sarcastic remark about breakfast. She was actively degrading my entire identity and the life I had built for myself. She was telling me that no matter how well educated I was, how successful my career was, how well I took care of myself, or how much my family financially contributed to our living situation, it meant absolutely nothing if I refused to shrink myself to fit the mold she demanded. Perhaps this was the true core of power in certain toxic households. It wasn't just about making the other person work harder. It was about making them feel that no matter how hard they tried, they would never be enough. It was designed to keep you endlessly chasing an approval that would never come, forcing you to unknowingly submit to their rules forever. I glanced at Richard again, hoping for some sort of reaction from the patriarch of the house. But he simply pulled a napkin from the dispenser, dabbed his mouth, and muttered into the void without looking at me. When it comes to household matters, women just need to be more detail-oriented. That's all. A short sentence that sounded like generic boomer advice, but it acted like a light switch being flipped on in a dark room, making the whole picture terrifyingly clear. This house didn't just have one villain wielding power, and it wasn't just Morgan playing mean girl games. It was an entire structural system built on a single shared belief. The new woman who enters must prove herself. She must endure. She must be disciplined. She must never argue. And above all, she must accept that her exhaustion, her feelings, and her dignity hold less value than the satisfaction of the people in this house. I slowly clenched my hands into fists until my nails dug into my palms. Yet, on the other side of my heart, a strange, freezing calmness settled in. It was the kind of coldness that washes over you when you see a truth so glaringly obvious that you can no longer lie to yourself. I looked at the dining table and flashed back to the reception hall yesterday. The luxury, the perfection, the smiles of the guests, the flowers, the lighting. Everything was so beautiful that I almost believed I was starting a wonderful new life. But this morning, I finally saw what was hiding under that pristine tablecloth. There was a constant nitpicking labeled as order. There was subjugation labeled as teaching. There was the husband's cowardice labeled as keeping the peace. And there was the infliction of paralyzing pain, elegantly rebranded as a wife's duty. Morgan stabbed a piece of potato with her fork and dropped it loudly onto her plate before speaking to her mother, all while staring directly at me. I told you, didn't I? Women these days dress nice and have great jobs, but when it comes to the house, they're practically useless. Eleanor nodded slowly. It comes down to how they were raised in their own homes. That sentence slashed into me like a razor blade. It wasn't just insulting me anymore. She was attacking my parents, the family that had raised me with respect, that had taught me to honor others without ever having to trample on myself to do so. I snapped my head up and locked eyes directly with Eleanor for the first time. I didn't look away. Eleanor, I might not know every single tradition of this house, but I didn't come here with bad intentions, and I certainly didn't intend to disrespect anyone. The entire room went dead silent. Even the faint hum of the refrigerator in the background suddenly sounded deafening. Eleanor set her coffee mug down. This time there was no trace of a smile. Are you talking back to me right now? Preston moved instantly. He turned to me, his face tight. Maya, stop it. I looked at him. A foolish part of me still hoped he would say, Mom, that was too harsh. Or, Maya didn't do anything that wrong. But those words never came. He only looked at me with eyes that demanded I shut up, submit, and swallow everything, just like I had always done. Right then, I felt like I was being backed against the edge of a cliff. The patience I had desperately tried to maintain since last night was backed into a corner with zero space left. The reality was manifesting in high definition. This place wasn't waiting for me to become family. They were waiting for me to become a person stripped of her right to even explain herself. And when an entire household is ready to call oppression rules, one day they will be just as ready to call violence deserved. Maya Preston snapped enough. His words weren't loud, but they sliced deeper than all the sarcastic comments before them, because those words told me definitively that in this house, he didn't view me as a wife he needed to protect. He viewed me as the entity that needed to be silenced so everyone else could be comfortable. I stared at him, unmoving. I waited for a fraction of a second. I waited to see if he would say more. Would he explain things for me? Would he tell his mother that I woke up before the sun, drove across the city, and cooked for the whole house without eating a single bite myself? Would he point out that I wasn't being rude, just offering a logical solution? But all he did was give me a tense glare that commanded me to stop speaking. It was as if the most important thing in the world wasn't what was right, but ensuring his mother was never displeased. Sometimes a woman doesn't lose faith in her marriage because she gets hit. Sometimes she loses faith the exact second she realizes that the man who held her hand and led her down the aisle will drop her hand instantly the moment he has to choose between justice and his own convenience. Ella Laner leaned back slowly in her chair, her voice colder and flatter than before. When a newcomer enters someone else's house and the elders give a warning, she should listen, not rush to explain how pure her intentions are. Whether someone is good or bad isn't measured by what they say. It's measured by whether they make the people around them uncomfortable. I heard it clearly. She was twisting the entire narrative to make me the cause of their discomfort. Since the moment I stepped foot inside, I hadn't done a single thing except follow her orders to the letter. I didn't argue. I didn't complain. I didn't show an ounce of displeasure. Yet, here I was being painted as the villain simply because I dared to clarify that I didn't intend to hurt anyone. Morgan sat with her legs crossed, looking me up and down like someone watching a reality TV show that was getting really good. I guess Maya just isn't used to this, living in a luxury condo her whole life. Asking her to actually take care of other people is probably too much for her brain to handle. She let out a dry laugh and turned to her mother. Some women are only good for looking pretty, but when it comes to real life, it's a different story. I knew instantly that she wasn't just throwing out a random insult. It was a targeted strike. It wasn't just attacking me as a new wife. It was degrading the entire life I had built. My career, my capabilities, my home, and everything that allowed me to stand firmly on my own 2 feet. Richard took another sip of his coffee before muttering exhaustedly, acting like a neutral party who didn't want to get involved. It's a minor issue. If you know the elders don't like it, just remember it for next time. That's all. On the surface, it sounded like a mediating comment meant to end the fight, but the truth was entirely different. It was a soft, diplomatic confirmation that the person who needed to adjust was me. The person who needed to remember her place and fix her behavior was me. As for the people sitting in a circle judging me, none of them needed to reflect on a single thing. I started to see the machinery. Clearly, this house didn't just have one bad actor. It operated as an ecosystem. Eleanor was the enforcer of the law. Morgan was the instigator. Richard provided the passive legitimacy. And Preston was the one who knew exactly what was happening, but chose to let it happen because as long as he wasn't the one getting hurt, he could always brush it off as a minor issue. Eleanor picked up her fork again and pushed a piece of egg around her plate. I'll be blunt. This house doesn't need a woman with fancy degrees or a flashy career. We need a woman who knows how to lower her head and take care of the family without needing to be walked through every step. If you're already failing at something this simple on your very first morning, what can we ever trust you with in the future? The phrase trust you with almost made me burst out laughing, even though my chest was tight with pain. Because the darkest, most ironic joke of all was that this family never genuinely entrusted me with anything. They only made demands and set expectations without ever offering an ounce of respect or sincerity in return. I looked at Preston again. This time, I wasn't hoping for a savior. I just wanted to see once and for all exactly how long this man would sit and watch me be degraded in front of his face. He remained exactly as he was, except this time his brow was slightly furrowed, as if he was getting annoyed that the situation was dragging on. He wasn't annoyed because I was being attacked. He was annoyed because I hadn't surrendered to the venom yet to make the scene end. Suddenly, Morgan reached over and pulled the plate of eggs toward herself, making an exaggerated face of disgust. It's all cold now. Like I said, if you don't plate things separately from the start, it just feels like eating scraps. The word scraps was dropped intentionally. I knew perfectly well she wasn't just talking about the food. She was talking about me, the new woman in the house who had no standing, no value, and could be made to feel like an unwanted leftover at any given moment. If you want something hot, Morgan, I can make it for you right now, I said, even though deep down I already knew that no matter what I said, it would only be used as fuel for the fire. Morgan's head snapped up. Why should I have to ask you for it? If you actually cared, you would have thought of it in the first place. She spun toward her brother. Preston, are you sure you picked the right person? That sentence plunged the room into a brief, suffocating silence. I saw a flicker in Eleanor's eyes, not of shock, but of sheer satisfaction that her daughter had said exactly what she herself wanted to say out loud. Richard remained motionless, like a scientist observing an experiment whose outcome he already knew. Preston let out a long, heavy sigh for the first time and turned to me, looking like a man who had completely lost his patience. Maya, why do you have to blow such a small thing out of proportion? I almost thought I misheard him. Such a small thing. For people were actively cornering me before 700 a.m. Insults were being hurled at me layer by layer. My dignity was being chipped away right in front of the husband I had married yesterday. And all he saw was a small thing. I've done everything I possibly could, I replied, my voice steadier than I expected. If you still call what's happening right here a small thing, then I genuinely don't know what constitutes a big thing to you. Eleanor slammed her fork down onto the table. The sound was violently loud, not just because she hit the table hard, but because the facade of polite endurance in this house was finally being ripped away. Is that the tone you use with your husband? I looked at her. I'm not trying to be disrespectful. I'm just speaking the truth. The truth. She let out a cold, guttural laugh. A woman who just married into this family yesterday manages to ruin everyone's appetite on the first morning. And you still think you're speaking the truth. Do you know that a woman with actual brains doesn't cause her husband this much distress? I heard it, and I understood instantly that this was the core of what they demanded. Not breakfast, not tradition. It was an indoctrination. They were teaching me that if I spoke up to defend myself, I was hurting my husband. If I refused to let them walk all over me, I was a bad wife. And if I felt hurt by their actions, it meant I was weak, classless, and unfit for this house. This is exactly how certain forms of domestic power operate. They don't just oppress you, they train you to feel guilty for refusing to be oppressed. I slowly straightened my posture. I didn't act aggressive. I didn't raise my voice, but inside my chest, something turned freezing cold, solidifying into a sheet of steel. I don't think speaking respectfully and explaining myself should cause anyone distress. If this family can't even handle that, then the problem isn't the breakfast. Morgan slammed her fork down instantly. Mom, look at her. She talks back to every single thing. Richard clicked his tongue loudly, sounding utterly irritated. If you try to talk to them nicely and they don't understand, it's a lost cause. But the person who sent a chill through my entire body wasn't either of them. Preston slowly stood up, pushing his chair back so hard the wooden legs screeched against the floor. He turned to look at me, and his eyes were completely foreign to me. They weren't the eyes of the gentleman who used to wait for me outside the pharmacy. They weren't the eyes of a lover asking if I was tired. They were the eyes of a man who felt he was being challenged in front of his mother and his family. And in a society like this, some men are far more terrified of losing face than they are of hurting the woman they married. I saw his jaw clench. I saw his breathing grow heavy. I saw one of his hands open, then curl into a tight fist, as Eleanor fell silent, as Morgan went quiet, and even as Richard stopped moving. Everyone seemed to be waiting for the exact same thing. In that split second, I understood with absolute clarity that this little dining table wasn't a place to eat. It was a courtroom where this family had collectively decided to sentence me to my proper place. And if I didn't drop to my knees and accept the role, they were fully prepared to use more extreme measures to force me down. Before I could even step back, Preston's hand shot out faster than my brain could register. A heavy open palm cracked against my left cheek with full force. The sharp, explosive sound echoed through the entire room. It sounded like something snapping in half in a single second. It wasn't just the sound of skin hitting skin. It was the sound of trust shattering, the sound of a dream breaking, the sound of a woman realizing her marriage was completely over before it had even begun. The sheer force of the slap whipped my head to the side. My body stumbled backward, slamming into the edge of the kitchen counter. A blinding pain shot from my cheekbone up to my temple and radiated down my jaw. A faint, high-pitched ringing filled my ears, as if the whole world had shrunk down to that single sound inside my head. Yet, despite all that, I didn't shed a single tear, nor did I even raise my hand to defend myself in the immediate aftermath. You can't even handle a simple task, and now you have the nerve to talk back to my family. Preston roared. His voice was heavier and more vicious than anything I had heard in the 2 years I knew him. Don't think just because you married into this family, you can do whatever the hell you want. His words were clearer than the sting of his palm, because they told me point blank that what he just did wasn't a sudden lapse in judgment. He didn't just lose control out of anger. He was actively punishing me. He was displaying his authority in front of his mother, his sister, and his father, announcing to the room exactly who held the power. I slowly turned my head back to look at him. My left cheek was burning, radiating heat as if someone was pressing a branding iron against my skin. The flesh felt so tight I could practically feel it swelling by the second. But the physical pain on my face was nothing compared to the absolute freezing horror in my heart when I realized that no one in the room was shocked. Eleanor sat perfectly still in her seat. Her expression barely changed. There was no gasp, no remorse, just the stillness of someone who witnessed the assault and genuinely didn't believe a line had been crossed. She simply lifted her coffee mug and took a slow sip, indirectly confirming that this was exactly what happened when a woman in this house forgot her place. Morgan stood frozen for a moment. Her eyes slightly widened, but the shock didn't last. It was quickly replaced by a poorly concealed mix of thrill and satisfaction. She didn't stop her brother. She didn't say he went too far. She didn't even step forward to see if I was okay. She just watched as if she were witnessing a rightful penalty she believed I fully deserved. And Richard, who had acted like a bystander this whole time, smoothly continued his role as the invisible man. He didn't stand up. He didn't speak. He didn't reprimand his own son. He simply lowered his eyes to the floor, as if to say that pretending not to look meant he carried no blame. This is the most brutal reality of domestic violence. It rarely happens in a vacuum. It thrives because one person acts, another enables, another instigates, and the rest choose to look away until it becomes normalized. I slowly raised my hand and touched my left cheek. My fingertips trembled slightly against the hot, swollen skin. The feeling in my head was incredibly strange. It wasn't completely blank. In fact, it was unnaturally clear. So clear that all the memories of the past 2 years flashed before me simultaneously. Preston's gentle smiles, the nights he waited for me after work, the water bottles he opened for me, the tiny details he used to remember flawlessly. All those images started peeling away like old paint stripped by acid, revealing the ugly truth underneath. The man standing over me right now, breathing heavily, had never truly been the gentle person I thought he was. Or more accurately, his gentleness was real, but it was never strong enough to stand by me when it came time to choose. What was stronger in him was his need to win, his fear of losing face, and his lifelong habit of expecting women to submit to him. When it was just the two of us, he could afford to be the good guy. But the moment the eyes of his family were on him, he instantly chose to be a man who used violence to maintain his dominance. I stared at him without breaking eye contact, and that seemed to enrage him even more because what he was waiting for wasn't a dead stare. He was waiting for me to cry. He was waiting for me to apologize, to beg his mother for forgiveness and say, "I was wrong. What are you looking at?" He snarled, "You mess up and you still don't even realize you're wrong." I didn't answer. Eleanor placed her mug back down on the table and spoke in an even colder, flatter voice. "Maya, sometimes we women need to learn that when we are in someone else's house, there are boundaries to what we say and do. Don't think your arrogance will work everywhere." The phrase "someone else's house" stabbed into me with lethal precision. Just yesterday, they were accepting my gifts and calling me a daughter-in-law. Today, the moment I refused to bow to them, they were fully prepared to remind me that I was an outsider. That's how this specific breed of abuser operates. They invoke the word family when they want to extract something from you, but they use the word outsider the second you demand your dignity back. I lowered my hand from my cheek. I looked at the 3 women and the father one by one before my eyes finally landed on Preston again. There was no love left in my heart. In that moment, there was only a truth as clear and sharp as broken glass. I understood that if I surrendered this morning, I knew exactly what the rest of my life would look like. Today he slapped me because I defended myself. Tomorrow he might shove me because I came home from work late. The next day he might grab my arm because I said something his mother didn't like. And every single time this family would find beautiful words to justify it. They'd call it discipline. They'd call it establishing order. They'd call it just the way men are. They'd call it tough love, but they would never ever call it by its true name, abuse. Some lessons in life don't hurt because they are unexpected. They hurt because deep down we saw the red flags long before the crash. We just chose to forgive. We chose to overlook. We chose to believe what we wanted to believe. I had seen how his mother controlled everything. I had seen how he never dared to contradict her. I had seen how several of their remarks never truly respected me. But I kept telling myself that after the wedding, things would magically get better. So many women fall into this trap. We aren't stupid. We're just hopeful. We aren't blind. We just believe that love will change people until one day, reality slaps us across the face before we finally accept it. I slowly pushed myself off the counter and stood up straight, even though my cheek was throbbing, my pulse pounding beneath the skin. My spine was straighter than it had ever been in my life. It's strange how physical pain didn't make me weaker. It triggered something inside me to harden instantly, like molten liquid suddenly flash, freezing into solid ice. Preston was still glaring at me. His eyes held both fury and expectation. He was waiting for me to yield, waiting for me to play the role the women in this family's folklore always played. To go quiet, lower my head, apologize, and start sweeping up the pieces of my own humiliation without causing anyone further inconvenience. But suddenly, I felt like I didn't want to say a single word, because a man who believes slapping his wife in front of his family is a valid teaching method doesn't want an explanation. A woman who sips her coffee after watching her son commit assault doesn't want logic. A sister who watches with smug satisfaction doesn't want to understand. And a husband who uses violence to put me in my place will never listen to the truth coming out of my mouth anyway. So why waste my breath? I looked down at the dining table in the center of the room. The kitch was still steaming faintly. The bacon I just fried. The potatoes I carefully seasoned for their palates. Everything was still sitting there, neat, clean, and warm, exactly how a Sunday brunch should look. But it was being used as an execution block for my dignity. And that was the moment something inside me snapped. I didn't need to prove anything to these people anymore. I didn't need to show them how well I could cook. I didn't need to prove how polite I was. I didn't need their approval to validate whether I was fit to be anyone's wife. And most importantly, I absolutely refused to stay in a place where people used cruelty to force me to call them family. I took a slow step away from where I stood. I walked right past Preston without even glancing at him. I could feel every eye in the room tracking my movements, but none of those stares made me hesitate for a fraction of a second. I stopped at the edge of the dining table. I lowered my gaze, staring quietly at the plates, the bowls, the glasses, and the serving platters. Eleanor's voice barked from behind me. "What are you doing?" I didn't answer, because in the exact moment a person's heart breaks completely, their retaliation doesn't start with words. It starts with a silent, irreversible decision that enough is enough. I placed both of my hands firmly under the edge of the dining table. The solid wood felt cold beneath my palms, but inside I was burning like a silent fire. It wasn't the out-of-control fire of blind rage. It was the hyper-focused fire of someone who saw reality. So clearly there was no room left for self-deception. Just minutes ago, this was a brunch table. It held the food I prepared with the dedication of someone still trying to respect this house. But now it wasn't a dining table. It was the judge's bench, where 4 people had unanimously decided to crush my dignity inch by inch and call it tradition. Call it manners. Call it a wife's duty. If they chose to use this table as the symbol of their power, then I would start dismantling that power right here. Maya Preston snapped again, his tone shifting from angry to wary. "Don TT, do something stupid." I didn't look at him. My left cheek throbbed with every heartbeat. But that pain was the perfect reminder that if I stayed silent today, one day, this family would consume my entire life until there was nothing left but the hollow shell of a woman who smiled and submitted. I shoved the table upward with every ounce of strength I had. The wooden legs screeched violently against the floorboards before the entire table flipped over with explosive force. Plates, bowls, glasses, and serving dishes launched into the air, seemingly suspended for a fraction of a second before crashing to the ground simultaneously. The sound of shattering ceramics and exploding glass blasted through the room. The kitchen smashed into the floor, splattering across the rug and the chair legs. The crispy bacon I had just fried scattered across the hardwood like worthless trash. Hot coffee poured across the grout lines, creating a mess that could never be undone. No one spoke for 2 full seconds. Those were probably the first 2 seconds since I stepped into this house that no one could control me. Eleanor was the first to react. She shot up from her chair, the mug in her hand shaking so badly that water sloshed onto her wrist. "What the hell is wrong with you?" Morgan's jaw dropped, her eyes wide, all her previous smugness completely evaporated. Richard shoved his chair backward to escape the shards of glass near his feet. his face going pale like a man realizing the situation was no longer following the script. And Preston, he stood, completely frozen, rooted to the spot, staring at the wreckage in absolute disbelief. It was as if he had never in his wildest dreams imagined that the woman he thought he could slap into submission would dare to physically obliterate the scene right in front of his eyes. I stood amidst the broken glass and spilled food, not taking a single step back. The hem of my dress was stained with coffee. My lips were trembling slightly from the adrenaline of my own breathing, but my eyes were so calm it surprised even me. I looked at their faces one by one, like someone waking up from a long nightmare. And because I was finally awake, I was no longer afraid. The only thing broken here isn't the breakfast, I said slowly, enunciating every syllable. My voice was lower and steadier than it had ever been. It's your delusion that I would stand here and let you trample on me and stay silent. Eleanor took one step toward me, but stopped as her shoe nudged a shard of a ceramic plate. Have you lost your damn mind? I looked her dead in the eye. No, today is the most sane I have ever been in my life. That answer was like a slap to her face, without me ever having to raise a hand. Preston stepped toward me, his face morphing from shock back to pure unadulterated rage. Maya, do you have any idea what you're doing right now? I let out a soft, dry laugh from the back of my throat. My first laugh of the morning. It wasn't the sound of someone having fun. It was the sound of someone who finally saw the absolute absurdity of their entire charade. I do. I'm putting an end to this psychotic, you're the one ruining everything. Morgan shrieked. I turned to her. No, the people ruining everything are the ones who think they have the right to abuse someone and expect them to never fight back. Morgan's face drained of color. She was used to mocking people. She was used to picking fights, backed by the safety net of her brother and mother. But she was absolutely not used to someone staring her down without an ounce of fear. Eleanor pointed a trembling finger right at my face. Get out of my house now. I stared at her finger, then slowly delivered the sentence that brought the entire room to a dead halt. Your house. No one moved, so I kept going, enunciating every word, pulling the curtain back on the reality they had all actively chosen to ignore. The luxury condo in River North that Preston and I are living in, the down payment, the security deposit, all the upfront costs. My parents paid for every single cent of it. The lease is solely in my name. If we're throwing around the phrase, someone else's house, the person who needs to be the most careful with those words is probably not me. Preston's face morphed instantly. He blinked rapidly, completely caught off guard. Why the hell would you bring that up? Why wouldn't I? I turned my gaze to him. When you slapped me in front of your entire family, you felt perfectly entitled to do it. So why shouldn't I be entitled to speak the truth? Richard, who had stayed silent for so long, finally spoke up, his voice hardening. Financial assets are a separate issue. Don't drag that into a family dispute. I whipped my head toward him. No, it is the exact same issue. I spoke loud and clear. Because the only reason you people felt comfortable degrading me was because you thought I had no way out. You thought that because I'm married in, I would have to endure, submit, and survive no matter how you treated me. But you all forgot one crucial detail. I didn't come into this life empty-handed, and more importantly, I never sold my dignity to anyone. Eleanor pressed her lips into a tight line. It was obvious she was trying to formulate a comeback, but her voice lost its unshakable confidence. Don't think a little bit of money gives you the right to walk all over your elders. I'm not using my money to walk over anyone, I replied instantly, but I absolutely refuse to let anyone use the title of elder to walk all over me. Those words landed in the room with such finality that even Preston was struck silent. I carefully stepped around the broken dishes and bent down to pick up my purse from the corner of the room. Every pair of eyes followed my movements wearily. They didn't know what I was going to do next, and that uncertainty was the exact thing that gave me the upper hand for the very first time. I looked at Preston one last time that morning. He still looked like the same man in the same t-shirt, but to me, there was absolutely nothing left connecting him to the man I once loved. Listen to me, carefully, I said slowly. You slapped me once today, but you made the rest of my life crystal clear. I see exactly what I would have to endure if I stayed. I see how many more times I would be hurt, and how many times your family would find beautiful words to justify it." He clenched his jaw, his fists trembling. "Maya, don't blow this out of proportion." I looked at him blankly. It was already out of proportion the second you raised your hand. Then I turned to Eleanor. "And as for you, don't worry. I won't be the daughter-in-law making this house uncomfortable ever again." "Good," Morgan shot back instantly. "Nobody is begging you to stay." I looked at her for a fraction of a second. "Save your energy. You're going to need it for much more important things very soon." She stopped dead, looking like she wanted to argue, but couldn't figure out what to say. I walked toward the front door without rushing, but every step was incredibly firm, even though my cheek was still throbbing, even though my chest hurt so much I could barely draw a full breath. Something inside my heart felt lighter with every step. It felt like a heavy chain was snapping off me link by link. Behind me, Eleanor started raising her voice, shouting after me. Preston shifted his weight as if he was going to follow. But when I opened the door and glanced back one last time, everyone had frozen in place. I wasn't looking at them like a defeated victim running away anymore. I looked at them like for people who had just destroyed their only chance of ever earning my respect. "After today, do not ever touch my life again," I said. "My final sentence. Prepare to deal with the consequences of what you've done." I slammed the heavy door shut with all my strength. The sound echoed down the quiet suburban street, and for the first time since before dawn, I felt like I could finally take a deep breath. Even though the morning air in Chicago was growing humid and harsh, it was infinitely better than the air inside a house where people called cruelty normal. Sometimes walking away from a place without looking back doesn't mean you've lost. It means you've finally stopped allowing other people to determine your worth. What do you think after she walked out of that house? Should her first move be to cry, disappear quietly, or begin a calculated retaliation? Let me know in the comments what you think her next step should be. I walked down the steps of the Oak Park house without glancing back a single time. The morning sun was starting to beat down on the city, but my left cheek felt degrees hotter than the sunlight. The stinging tension under my skin pulsed in time with my heartbeat. Every step I took felt like a sharp blade scraping against my bones. Yet, strangely enough, I didn't shed a single tear. It wasn't because I wasn't in pain, but because the pain I felt that morning had bypassed the threshold of crying entirely. When a person watches the reality of their own life collapse right in front of them, the tears don't always fall right away. Instead, they go perfectly still, a terrifying stillness like an ocean, so deep you can't see the bottom, and the stiller the surface, the more it means whatever is underneath is changing shape permanently. I opened the car door, got behind the steering wheel, and rested my hands quietly on my lap. I didn't start the engine yet. The street outside was waking up. A neighbor was walking a dog in the distance. A delivery truck rattled past. The sound of a garage door opening echoed nearby. It felt like a totally normal morning for the rest of the world. I was the only one whose life had just been snapped in half. I looked up at my reflection in the rear view mirror. The red mark on my left cheek was becoming more prominent by the minute. The skin over my cheekbone was noticeably swollen, even in the dim light of the car interior. It made my face look alien to me, not because the bruise ruined my appearance, but because it was a brand signifying that I no longer lived in the world I thought I did. Last night, I was a bride. This morning, I was a woman whose husband struck her in front of his family. And what was even more horrifying was that everyone in that house believed he was well within his rights to do it. I closed my eyes, leaned my head back against the headrest, and took one massive deep breath. The faint, expensive perfume I had sprayed on myself last night still lingered on my collar. It brought back flashes of the wedding, the smiles, the venue lights, the clinking glasses, the guests wishing us a smooth and warm married life. All of it now felt so impossibly distant, like it belonged to someone else's life entirely. Society loves to teach women that once you're married, you have to endure, you have to adapt, you have to respect the elders. You have to learn to stay quiet and keep the peace because every family has its problems. But no one ever tells us where the line is between adapting and being destroyed. No one tells us that one day the word endurance might be used as the first rope to quietly strangle us. No one tells us that if we forgive the first insult, it paves the road for the first physical blow. And if we stay quiet after that first blow, our entire lives might be beaten down until there is nothing left to call our own. I opened my eyes. This time, the thoughts in my head were chillingly clear, as if someone had flipped the switch on hope and turned on survival instead. I picked up my phone. My thumb instantly scrolled to the first name on my favorites list. Dad. My finger hovered over his name for 1 second, not because I was hesitating to call, but because I knew that the moment I pressed call, I would no longer be the woman trying to salvage her marriage. I would become someone who fully admitted to herself that this required action, not endurance. I pressed call. The phone didn't even ring 3 times before he picked up. Maya, my dad's voice, still held a trace of morning grogginess, but it was solid enough to make my heart, which had been frozen solid, tremble slightly. I stared straight ahead, watching the sunlight slice across the windshield. Dad, that was all I managed to say before I stopped. Not because I wanted to cry, but because I was searching for the right words to describe a reality this ugly. The line went dead silent for a fraction of a second before my dad asked, his tone shifting instantly. What happened? I didn't give him a long, drawn-out story. I didn't start with the breakfast. I didn't start with the mother-in-law's insults. I didn't mention the tension from the night before. I simply stated the only sentence that mattered. He slapped me. There was no gasp, no panic questions, no useless attempts to calm me down. There was only a heavy 3-second silence on the other end of the line. And that silence told me my dad understood the gravity of the situation immediately. Where are you right now? He asked. In my car. I just left his parents' house. My dad's voice was completely steady, almost glacial. Do not go back to the condo right now. Drive to the nearest emergency room or urgent care. Have a doctor examine you. Get a medical certificate. Take photos of everything. Document all. Then, send me your location. Okay. I closed my eyes briefly. The tightness in my chest loosened just a fraction. Not because the situation was magically better, but because, finally, I was hearing words that weren't trying to trick me into enduring. He wasn't trying to mediate. He didn't tell me to calm down or to talk it out with the family. My dad didn't treat what happened as a man's momentary lapse in judgment. He treated it exactly as it needed to be treated, as criminal violence. Yes, I replied. Maya, my dad said my name once more before hanging up. Do not be alone with him for another second. That was all it took for me to realize that a person's true home isn't the house they marry into. A true home is the place where people listen to you without ever questioning if you deserve to be abused. I hung up the phone and started the engine. My hands were still shaking slightly on the steering wheel, but my mind was sharpening by the minute. I pulled out of the suburban streets and merged onto the highway. The 7:30 a.m. morning rush in Chicago was coming alive. Traffic backed up at the major intersections, horns honking in the distance. Life all around me was moving forward, normally, but inside this car, I was transitioning from a victim of abuse to a woman methodically gathering the evidence to take her life back. While stopped at a red light, I looked at my face in the mirror again. A razor-sharp thought crossed my mind. If I went back to him today, saying, let's talk things out, if I let his mother tell me family matters stay in the family, if I let this bruise heal without any documentation, one day I might be the first person to doubt if it ever really happened. And that is exactly how so many victims are slowly silenced. I refused to become one of them. When I arrived at Northwestern Memorial Hospital in downtown Chicago, I parked and stepped out, even though my legs still felt a phantom tremor. The ER lobby was freezing. The sterile smell of antiseptic and filtered air made me feel like I had stepped into an entirely different universe. A universe built on systems and protocols where no one could use the word tradition to camouflage brutality. The triage nurse at the front desk looked up and her eyes immediately locked onto my left cheek. "You need to see an ER doctor," she asked softly. I nodded. "Yes, and I need a medical report for assault." She looked at me again. This time, her professional gaze softened with quiet, undeniable understanding. "Of course, right this way." Sitting in the exam room, I finally realized my hands had been clenched into fists the entire time. My fingernails had left deep crescent moons in my palms. I slowly relaxed my fingers and stared at the marks. The human body is incredibly resilient. It tries to hold itself together, even when something inside has just been violently ripped apart. The doctor was a woman in her late 40s. She had me sit under the bright, white examination lights and asked in a calm, direct, and professional tone, "Were you struck by an object? Or was this a physical blow?" I answered her with the utmost clarity I could muster that morning. "I was slapped by my husband." Speaking that sentence out loud to a stranger solidified the reality even further. It wasn't something in my head. It wasn't a minor issue. It wasn't a lover's spat. It was a man using physical force against his wife. The doctor examined the injury, gently pressing the area around my cheekbone. I winced slightly. A sharp pain shot straight up to the corner of my eye. She took several photographs from different angles, gave me an ice pack, and informed me that she would generate a comprehensive medical report detailing the blunt force trauma, which I could use as legal evidence. "Keep all of this in a safe place," she told me. I nodded. "I will." When I walked out of the exam room, I gripped the crisp, white envelope tightly. It wasn't thick. It didn't weigh much. But to me in that moment, it held more weight than the vows I took last night, because this was the first piece of tangible, undeniable reality, a reality that he and his family had no power to twist. I stood in the hospital corridor watching people rush by and suddenly felt a bizarre sense of peace. It wasn't the peace of someone whose pain was gone. It was the peace of someone who had finally stopped hoping for something impossible. I didn't love Preston anymore. In that single moment, I didn't care if he felt guilty. I didn't want to hear his apologies. I didn't want to see his mother fake cry. And I absolutely did not want to negotiate terms to stay in that toxic dynamic. I wanted exactly one thing: my life back. I pulled out my phone and opened the email the doctor had sent with the medical photos. The images were stark, showing the red, swollen, bruising from every angle. I stared at them for a moment, silently reminding myself, this is evidence, not a source of shame. Too many women are taught to hide their bruises because they fear the stigma of a failed marriage. But true failure isn't admitting you were abused. True failure is allowing someone to abuse you and calling it something you just have to endure. I sent the hospital's address to my dad, forwarded the files to him, and typed a single definitive sentence. I'm ready to never look back, ready to stop protecting the guilty, ready to ensure no one ever used love as a cage to trap me again. And now that I had the first piece of evidence in my hand, the next step wasn't to go somewhere and cry. It was to systematically sever every single tie, binding me to that family with surgical precision, leaving no avenue for them to ever trample on me again. I walked out of the hospital, clutching the envelope to my chest. The throbbing in my cheek hadn't faded, but internally I was a completely different person. The love, the desire to please, the urge to protect his family's reputation, the desperate hope that if we just talk, things will go back to normal. All of those instincts had been left behind on the floor of that Oak Park house the moment Preston's hand connected with my face. I wasn't driving back with the heart of a wife. I was driving back with the cold logic of a woman executing a retrieval mission. Mid-morning traffic was brutal. Cars crawled toward the loop, engines humming, horns blaring. But inside my car, my mind was running through a checklist with terrifying clarity. Change the condo passcode. Secure essential documents. Transfer all joint funds back to my private accounts. Cancel his supplementary credit cards. Call a lawyer. People often assume that after being assaulted, a woman should focus on crying and processing the trauma first. But in the real world, if you waste too much time crying, your abuser uses that time to prepare. They cover their tracks, spin the narrative, and lock down the very assets that tie you to them. I was not going to let that happen. When I reached my luxury high-rise in River North, I parked in my assigned spot and took the elevator up. As the mirrored doors reflected my face, the bruising on my left cheek looked darker than before. My eyes were noticeably colder. Looking at my reflection, I knew that the woman in the glass would never allow herself to be subjected to anyone's hand ever again. The front door to the condo still opened with the original passcode. Preston's birthday. When we first moved in, he suggested we use his birthday because it was easy to remember and made it feel like our home. Just a day ago, I had smiled at that little detail. Today, my fingers punched those numbers with absolute indifference. As soon as the door clicked open, I felt like I was stepping onto a battlefield to reclaim everything that defined us. The apartment looked exactly the same. Preston's leather loafers were kicked off near the entryway. The 2 water glasses from last night sat on the kitchen island. The throw pillows on the sofa were still indented from where we had sat looking through wedding photos. Everything looked so painfully normal, completely ignorant to the fact that something had violently died this morning. I closed the door, locked the deadbolt, and walked straight to the digital keypad panel on the wall. My hands were perfectly steady as I accessed the admin settings. I deleted his birthday code. I wiped the backup codes he had made. I entered a new master code. My father's birthday. A short beep confirmed the change. I stood there listening to that beep, feeling as if I had just dropped a massive steel door between my life and that man. Sometimes protecting yourself starts with the smallest action. It isn't always a grand speech. Sometimes it's just systematically locking the people who hurt you out of your sanctuary, one door at a time. Next, I walked over to the small desk in our bedroom. I opened the drawers and pulled out my USB drives, my digital security keys, the lease agreement, and all our financial documents, stacking them neatly on the desk. The truth that I had always known, but never used as a weapon, was now becoming the pillar I stood on. The lease to this apartment was strictly in my name. The massive security deposit and upfront rent had been paid from my parents' account. The primary credit cards used for household expenses were under my name. Preston merely held supplementary cards tied to my credit line. Even our joint future fund savings account, the money we planned to use for a house or kids, was funded almost entirely by my paycheck. While we were dating, I never threw this in his face. When you love someone, you don't keep score. But certain types of people interpret your generosity as a right. They view your silence as weakness. They believe that because you support them, they can stand on your shoulders and then kick you down. I opened my laptop, plugged in my bank authentication key, and logged into our joint financial portals. The funds in the savings account were still untouched. Staring at that number, I remembered the countless nights I worked late, skipping little luxuries, quietly routing my annual bonuses and savings into this account. But this morning taught me that if I left that money where it was, it would simply become a financial cushion for the man who just hit me. I clicked on the transfer menu. I typed in the routing number for an entirely separate private account in my name. I selected the maximum available balance, verified the details, and hit confirm. The screen buffered for a second before displaying transaction successful. I didn't feel a rush of vengeance. I felt a profound sense of justice. Taking back your own resources isn't revenge. It's cutting off the oxygen supply to the person who abused you. I pulled the authenticator from my laptop, picked up my cell phone, and called the customer service line for my credit card company. My voice was calm, clear, and so decisive that the representative didn't need to ask me to repeat myself. I need to temporarily freeze all primary cards on this account and permanently revoke all authorized user cards immediately. The representative went through the security protocols. I answered every verification question flawlessly before she confirmed. All supplementary cards have been deactivated, effective immediately. I hung up. I stared at my phone screen, and a very distinct image popped into my head. Preston standing at a cash register, pulling out his card to pay for something, only to see the machine flash declined. I knew him well enough to picture his exact facial expression. I knew he would be furious, I knew he would feel utterly humiliated, and for the first time, I had zero desire to protect his ego. A man whose primary concern is saving face, so much so that he strikes his wife in front of an audience, deserves to learn a very hard lesson about humiliation. But my financial assets were only the beginning. The real storm was just starting. I opened my contacts and scrolled to Audrey. She was an older sorority sister from college who had gone on to become a highly recommended family law attorney. We didn't talk every day, but she was the exact type of person you called when you needed ruthless efficiency, not empty sympathy. She picked up on the second ring. Maya calling during the honeymoon phase. What's going on? I didn't beat around the bush. I need a lawyer for assault and divorce. The line went dead quiet for a microcond before her voice dropped into a lethal professional register. Who did it? The husband. Yes, I said the word faster and clearer than before. Every time I spoke the truth out loud, it lost a little more of its power to terrify me and transformed into a tool I could use to destroy the situation. Do you have evidence? She asked. I have the ER medical report, photographs of the bruising, and I left his parents' house immediately. Excellent. Do not meet him alone. If he shows up at your door, do not open it. Digitize all those documents and send them to my secure portal by the end of the day. She paused, then added, Maya, listen to me. Do not cave when he starts calling and begging. A man who feels comfortable hitting you on day one didn't just lose control. He's testing the waters to see what he can get away with next time. I closed my eyes. Her words were sharp, but 100% accurate. I won't cave, I replied. After hanging up, I organized the hard copies, the medical report, the lease, the bank transfer receipts into a neat folder. Before I knew it, I was doing the exact same thing I did when organizing prescriptions at the pharmacy, sorting by category, cross-checking data, preventing errors, and prepping everything for a smooth handoff. It was ironic that the skills I used to heal people were now the very skills saving me from my own marriage. Right then, my phone buzzed. Preston's name flashed on the screen. I stared at it. I didn't answer. The call dropped, then immediately rang again and again. I hit decline on the third attempt, went into my settings, and blocked his number entirely. The silence that followed made the apartment feel impossibly still, save for the faint hum of the HVAC unit. I knew this was just the calm before the storm. In a few hours, he was going to realize the cards were dead. He was going to see the bank accounts drained. He was going to find out his code to the condo didn't work. And that meant he and his family were about to realize that the woman they thought would cry and crawl back for forgiveness was methodically dismantling their access to her life piece by piece. I walked over to the Florida ceiling windows and looked out over the Chicago skyline, the late morning sun catching on the glass of 100 skyscrapers. Somewhere out there in the city, there were probably thousands of women telling themselves to endure even when they knew deep down it wasn't love. It was slow, agonizing destruction. I only hoped that if my story meant anything, it would serve as this lesson. Do not wait for someone else to validate that your wounds are worth protecting. Do not wait for your abuser to feel remorse before you defend yourself. And never, ever believe that taking back what belongs to you makes you the bad guy. Sometimes the greatest act of mercy you can perform in your life isn't forgiving the person who hurt you. It's making absolutely sure they can never do it to you again. I turned back to look at the folder on my desk and my silent phone. A massive hurricane was about to make landfall, but it wasn't going to wreck my life. It was going to wreck Preston's. It was time for the man who was so used to stepping on others to realize he had just lost his money, his home, and his control. He was about to show his true colors more vividly than ever before. By 700 p.m., I was sitting on the sofa in a dimly lit living room. I hadn't turned on the overhead lights, relying only on a corner floor lamp. In my lap was an iPad linked to the doorbell camera in the hallway. The apartment was surreal in its quietness, almost as if it wasn't the same place where two people had sat flipping through wedding proofs just 24 hours ago. But the silence here wasn't like the silence in Oak Park. That silence was designed to crush you. This silence was designed to protect. The iPad screen flickered to life. displaying a crisp, high-definition feed of the hallway. Preston was standing outside the door. He was still in his work clothes. His tie was undone, his sleeves rolled up to the elbows. His face looked tighter, more rigid than I had ever seen it. He stood in front of the keypad with the casual expectation of a man who still believed he had an inherent right to enter this space. He raised his hand and punched in his code, quickly. His birthday, the code he had used effortlessly, expecting the lock to disengage. A short, sharp beep rang out. Invalid code. He froze for a second, his brow furrowing. He punched the numbers in again, slower this time, clearly thinking he had just miskeyed it. Invalid code. I watched the screen without moving a muscle. My breathing didn't hitch. I didn't feel the rush of vindictive triumph I thought I might. Instead, a wave of cool clinical detachment washed over me. This was just reality taking its natural course. Preston dropped his hand from the keypad. He looked left and right down the empty corridor, as if hoping the door would magically swing open on its own. Then he grabbed the handle and yanked it hard twice. The heavy door didn't budge an inch. I remembered exactly how confident he looked when he slapped me. He was so sure of himself, sure that I would submit, sure that I couldn't fight back, sure that the social conditioning telling women to be a good wife would drag me back to him. But looking at him now, that arrogant certainty was completely gone. In its place stood a man slowly realizing that he might not own a single damn thing in this life. He pulled out his phone and dialed. I watched his name light up on the screen of my phone. I watched it calmly, then hit decline and tossed the phone aside. 3 seconds later, he called again. Declined. On the third try, I didn't even let it ring. I powered the device down completely and turned my attention back to the iPad. Outside, Preston took a step back. His face was dark with frustration. Suddenly, he raised his fist and slammed it into the heavy door. The thud reverberated into the apartment, but I didn't even flinch. In the past, I might have panicked. I would have rushed to open it, terrified he was angry, terrified the neighbors would hear, terrified of the stigma of a wife locking her husband out. But now, I understood that that specific kind of fear is exactly what keeps women trapped. We are trained to take responsibility for the image of the marriage, for keeping the peace, and for hiding the abuser's shame to the point where protecting ourselves feels like an act of selfishness. I wasn't playing by those rules anymore. He pounded on the door again, harder this time. On the silent video feed, I could see his mouth moving rapidly. I didn't need audio to know he was yelling my name, demanding to know what the hell I was doing, desperately trying to yank the control back into his hands. But it was too late. My backup phone vibrated on the coffee table. It was a text from Audrey. If he shows up, do not open the door. Do not engage. Screen grab everything. I typed back a quick reply. He's here. I'm not opening it. I took 3 screenshots from the live feed. One of him trying the keypad. One of him hitting the door. One of his face morphing from irritation into genuine panic. After a few minutes, he backed away from the door and paced down to the end of the hallway to make a phone call. His shoulders were stiff, his posture tense. He looked exactly like a man who was connecting a series of catastrophic dots. It wasn't hard to guess what he had discovered. His supplementary cards were dead. The joint savings were gone. His calls were blocked. The apartment was secured. He was finally understanding that I wasn't throwing a tantrum. I was surgically excising him from my life. A moment later, my backup phone rang again. It was an unknown number, but when I picked it up, Eleanor's voice pierced through the speaker without so much as a hello. Maya, what the hell do you think you're doing? I almost laughed. A woman who had spent the entire morning using her family to subjugate me now viewed my self-defense as a game. I'm not playing games. Eleanor, I said evenly, I'm managing my life. Managing your life. She shrieked. You are his wife. That apartment is my son's home. What right do you have to change the locks? I glanced at the folder on my desk. The right of the sole leaseholder who pays the rent. The line went dead quiet. That silence was golden. It was the sound of a woman realizing that the technicalities she had conveniently ignored were now wrapped around her own neck. Even if your name is on the lease. You married my son. She snapped. though her voice had lost its ironclad authority. Couples fight. Maya, it's perfectly normal. Why are you destroying your life over something so trivial? Over this. Over this. People like her use those words to dismiss everything. A minor insult is just this. A slap is just this. Enduring abuse is just this. Until eventually a woman's entire existence is sliced into pieces and swept under the rug of just this. If it was just this, Eleanor, I replied cleanly, you wouldn't be calling me. Silence again, but this time, it stretched longer. When people who rely on intimidation realize you want absolutely nothing from them, their power evaporates. Maya, her tone suddenly shifted, attempting to soften, trying to sound reasonable. If the breakfast thing this morning was too much, we can sit down and talk about it like adults. You didn't have to go this far. Preston is under a lot of stress at work. You should try to be a little more understanding. I sat on my sofa, feeling utterly numb to her manipulation. It was the classic abuser's playbook. Minimize the violence, attribute it to external stress, and immediately shift the burden of understanding back onto the victim. I understand perfectly, Eleanor, I said. That's exactly why I will never step foot near him or you ever again. I hung up and immediately blocked the number. I wasn't going to give her a single inch of space to rewrite the narrative. As the screen went dark, the apartment settled back into its profound quiet. I poured myself a glass of water, took a slow sip, and watched the lights of the Chicago high-rises flickering in the night. I knew that on the other side of this door, a meltdown was happening. Eleanor was probably screaming. Morgan was probably throwing a fit over her canceled credit card privileges. Richard was probably looking grim, but doing absolutely nothing. And Preston was standing in a luxury, high-rise hallway, feeling the ground vanish beneath his feet. What they had lost wasn't just access to a condo or a bank account. They had lost the delusion that I would ever be their victim again. Around 800 p.m., a text message pinged from an unknown burner number. Maya, we need to talk. No apology. No. Are you okay? No. Does your face hurt? Just a demand that we talk. As if talking was the magic wand he could wave to drag me back into his orbit. I didn't reply. A second text followed immediately. Don't make this more complicated than it needs to be. I actually smiled, a faint, genuine smile, because the man who had violently complicated my life to the point where I needed an ER visit was now terrified of things getting complicated for him. I placed the phone face down on the coffee table and leaned back into the sofa. My left cheek was still stiff, sore, and heavy, but that pain was no longer the only thing left. I was starting to see the tangible results of my choices. The man who used his fists was now locked out in the cold. The woman who issued commands was reduced to negotiating over the phone. The family that stood on a pedestal was collapsing the second I pulled my resources out from under them. The brutal truth is this. People who oppress you are rarely as strong as they pretend to be. Most of the time, they're simply standing on your resources, your patience, your silence, and your fear of walking away the moment you snatch those things back. They cannot even stand on their own 2 feet. I reached over, picked up the Northwestern Memorial Hospital envelope, and traced my finger over the seal. Tonight was not the night my life fell apart. Tonight was the night the family that tried to break me began to crumble under the weight of their own arrogance. That night, I sat alone in a silence that had never felt so comforting. No heavy sighs from a judgmental mother-in-law. No glaring eyes picking apart my every move. No demands disguised as duties. Just the sound of my own breathing, the hum of the AC, and a heart that, despite being broken, finally belonged entirely to me again. I raised my hand and lightly touched the bruise on my cheek. It hurt, yes, but it was no longer a badge of shame. It was a reminder that on the exact same day I was abused, I chose to end the cycle with my own 2 hands. I finally understood that a true home isn't a place where you have to shrink yourself until you lose your voice. It isn't a place where you trade your dignity for the title of family. And it certainly isn't a place where silence is used to protect the guilty. A true home is a place where you never have to be terrified of speaking the truth. That night, I didn't win against anyone. I just won myself back. And for a woman, that might just be the greatest victory of all. If you were in my shoes after surviving a night like this, would you quietly move on and start fresh? Or would you make sure the people who hurt you faced every legal consequence possible? Let me know what you would do in the comments below.